Hello, everybody. My name is Leilainia with the Sunset Parlor here in El Paso, Texas. And I'm so excited to be joined today by Winston Hampton, and Richard Powell will be joining us here soon as well. Richard Powell has a doctorate in spiritual science and a long, fun history with Winston Hampton. So a little bit about Winston Hampton. He is an avid spiritual seeker, a poet, a writer, an energy worker. He has studied yoga, sacred sexuality, aura balancing, energy medicine, and Shavda yoga. He is a poet and he's an inspiration to so many of us. And his flow of writing is from his life experiences. And he writes in order to share his life with us all. Richard Powell, would you like to join us?
I would.
Good. All right.
Hello, Richard and Leilainia. How nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I know that you've written a couple of books, and I'm really excited to get into one of them that you wrote recently.
And so you wrote this book about how different drugs affect your energy field.
That's a good place to start because there's really so much to be said about all that whole subject.
Yeah.
And the book really does go into a lot of different aspects of it. The whole psychedelic world has really got some momentum right now. And there's a lot of proponents for it who really, they want psychedelics to get used for healing purposes, to help people open up to new awarenesses, all of that. But none of them really are talking about the energetic side of it. And I've noticed more and more they keep going to the biological side of it. Yeah. Like they're really getting into brain chemistry and different parts of the brain. And all they're doing is observing what's taking place when people do the psychedelic. But they're just observing the physical structures. They're not observing the energetic side of it. So my book, because of my experience and then my training on all of the energy medicine and the whole energetic side of it, which is both as an aura balancer in terms of training to work with people's energy field for healing and balancing, but also the spiritual side in terms of who we are as energetic spiritual beings in a wholesome way, balanced. In my study of spirituality, what I see is that if you're doing a spiritual practice that works, then healing and balancing naturally starts to take place in your consciousness. Mm-hmm. And if it's working, then you start developing this deep resilience in your consciousness. And you start anchoring into this part of yourself that's sure of itself, that knows itself, that's worthy. You start anchoring into your heart center, into your loving.
So when I read your book, it explained a lot about the healing process and how different substances do affect your energy field, which affects your psychology, which then affects your body and your environment.
Most of the Western psychological approach really is all about balancing the ego structures. But if you do spiritual psychology, then it adds this whole other dimension to it. So you're not just balancing the ego structures, you're actually waking up the spiritual part of who you are. And that's a completely different thing. It's a whole different thing, the experience of that. Yeah.
So I think because there is such a big movement in the psychedelic world and smoking weed is becoming normalized. And I think it's really important to talk about the energy side of these substances so that people go into it aware of what's happening to them and take a conscious decision on where they want their energy to be.
So the rips and the tears in the subtle bodies show up in consciousness as psychological symptoms or felt, sensed symptoms that people have in their consciousness. In my training, I was taught, so there's the physical body, then there's the imaginational body, which is the astral body. A lot of traditions talk about the astral body and astral projection and, various astral things. The causal body, which is the emotional body, the mental body, and the etheric body is the unconscious part of us. So Western psychology has identified, we know what about all the bodies, but we don't see them in those terms. We see them more as part of the states of our consciousness or aspects of our consciousness. But the energetic viewpoint is a little different to actually see it that way. And each one vibrates at a different frequency, which means that they can all exist in the same space, because each one is kind of like on a different level. Yeah, so those are the subtle bodies. And one of the things that happens when you do psychedelics, and it can happen on marijuana too. Marijuana is kind of a semi-psychedelic in my viewpoint. The chakra centers, so the chakra centers in the East, they're seen often as lotus blossoms. So if you're clairvoyant and you're going to actually see the chakra center, it does look like a flower with petals. And the petals are closed, and then the petals can open. So the opening and closing of the petals of the chakras, and chakras are they're transmutation. They're part of the transmutation in our consciousness. Like there's this whole interaction between our physical body, imagination, emotional, mental, unconscious, all the interaction that creates this whole consciousness of who we are as human beings. The chakras are essential. They, energy passes through them, comes and goes, and they transmute energy from one frequency to another. Any kind of clairvoyant awareness takes place through the chakras. So a true clairvoyant who actually sees subtly, energy fields or whatever, or hears, clairaudience, those people, those psychics who can do that, they can open the petals in their chakra and close them. They can open and close them as they use that facility. Psychedelics force them open. Boom, they're forced open. So the chakras also protect us from psychic energies in our environment. I mean, our environment's full of these other subtle energies. And we do need to be protected. And that's part of the function of the actual aura, is to create a cohesive consciousness and keep it cohesive as we walk through the world and are in the midst of all these other subtle energies. So for me, I had some chakra center forced open by the psychedelic use, and it pretty much stayed open for quite a while. And interestingly enough, later when I started doing a spiritual practice, then that healed, and then they closed again. Which I prefer, because I prefer not to deal with these unknown, invisible psychic influence in my consciousness. Like, I want that protection. Yep.
So, like you said, when you were doing marijuana, it was made it easier on your daily life because it was dulling a lot of the stress, which you think is nice. Like, oh, let's drink some wine to relax. Let's smoke a joint to just relax and dull it. But if you live a dulled life, eventually those things that you're doling out are going to come back even louder and more aggressive in your psyche. So, and then when you're coming back to deal with those and they're more aggressive and loud within you, and you're not strong on these subtle levels because you've dampened them or torn them, or they're sheets blowing in the wind, there's nothing holding them together, then it's going to be a lot harder to go into the transition of being sober, especially if you don't understand what's happening.
Yep, that's for sure.
Yeah. So that's why I think anyone who is going through the transition of becoming sober in your life should read your book. I think it's a really beautiful explanation of what people may be going through. And I also think it's really important for people who are starting to experiment with different substances to also read your book so that they understand the risks on an energetic level of what they're going into.
I totally agree. I wholeheartedly agree. Yep. And maybe our next conversation will focus on marijuana. There's a lot to say about that very, specifically. And it's the sort of things that, hotheads, people who love to get high on marijuana, they'll recognize most of this. They'll recognize it. Especially the longer that they do it, right? If you're just starting out getting high, it's such a new experience that, like any new experience, like, wow, this is amazing. But yeah, as you keep doing it, some of the ways that it affects us, that in the long run, it's like, oh yeah, I don't know if I really want that,
Yeah. But I also want to know about your history with your spiritual journey, with your own life, and because I find it fascinating. You are fascinating, Winston.
Well, thank you, Richard. I'm fascinated too by myself. I'm still trying to figure me out. Gosh, my spiritual journey story, I'll say that as briefly as I can. Basically, when I hit puberty at about 13, I had the same questions a lot of people maybe have, like, who am I? What am I doing here? What's life about? And for me, that was much deeper. I actually went to my minister at church. I asked my parents, and I felt pretty dissatisfied with all the answers I got. So late 60s, early 70s, that was, the drug days. That was the hippie, make love, not war. So my curiosity stepped in and I started experimenting with drugs. For me, I had spiritual awakening experiences pretty much right away. That was my first real awareness of the whole energetic thing. And I started seeing auras. I started seeing energy fields and auras around pretty much everything. I find it fascinating that even though I was having these mystical experiences and discoveries of who I am as a spiritual being, I was still being incredibly human at the same time. I was dealing with the same problems and issues that any teenager deals with. My girlfriend broke up with me. I was heartbroken. My awakening in the psychedelics didn't really lift me above all of that. Not really. But it gave me a very different perspective on life, on my life. I started doing that when I was about 15. By the time I was 18 or 19, and I was experimenting with all kinds of drugs. Pretty much the whole array of what's available out there. These days, ketamine is kind of a thing, but back then it was PCP. But actually, they're pretty much the same thing. That's something probably a lot of people aren't aware of. So when people talk about their ketamine experiences, I can go, I know exactly what that is. So then I basically became, I guess I would say, addicted to drugs. So marijuana, I stayed high like all the time. Marijuana was my go-to drug. So then by the time I was, 20, 21, 22, I realized, oh my God, I'm using certain drugs to get through the day, to deal with stuff. And that felt terrible. I hated that, actually. When they say a monkey on your back, that's really what I felt like. And marijuana was the main one, because I discovered that it handled my stress and my anxiety and any emotional issues I had. It just created a baseline where I didn't have to deal with any of that with myself. So then I decided I need to get off drugs. I need to stop doing drugs. And but I was still very driven by my desire and need to wake up spiritually, to become more spiritually aware. And in some of the major books that have been written by these psychedelic pioneers, they've identified all these different states of consciousness that you get to have. The unity consciousness, all is one. And actually, one of my favorite books at that time was Ram Dass's Be Here Now. It was a great awakening book for me. He pretty much said it all in that book. I was like, that was kind of my Bible for a while. But I was also reading the Bhagavad Gita cover to cover, the Bible cover to cover, starting to just try to read any book about spirituality or yoga or any of that stuff that I could get my hands on. And of course, there was no internet back then.
No.
Can you imagine that? No internet.
Yeah.
You couldn't Google something. You had to go research some other way. Yeah.
What kind of helped you transition into a sober consciousness?
Yeah, so towards the end of my drug days, I struggled with really trying to get off, and found that it wasn't going to be that easy. That wasn't so much the psychedelics. The psychedelics were, they're very intense experiences, and that wasn't something that I did a lot. But the marijuana and actually cocaine was one of my drugs of choice at the time. So then I decided I need to find a spiritual teacher who can help me deal with this stuff and help me answer quick questions. And right about that time, an ex-girlfriend of mine shared that she had a dream with me that I went with her to this spiritual center that was in southern New Mexico or so. I said, okay, I'll come and do that. And went down to this spiritual center in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And we pulled up in front of this residence, and I was like, what's this? She said, this is it. And I looked at it, and there was this big dome of white light over this house. And I thought to myself, I see energy fields like all over the place, but I haven't ever seen a dome of white light like this. That's very interesting. Went in and met the folks there. Robert Waterman, one of those primary people who's been a teacher and a friend all these years. Vivian Power, who was one of my, strong teachers. And she was, I think she might have been in her 80s at that point. But she was this very dynamic, white-haired lady, who saw auras and did all this aura balancing and energy field stuff and worked with the Christ energy. So I met these folks, and I was like, something inside just said, you need to do this. This was in 1979.
Wow. And you were how old?
I was 23.
Wow, that's pretty young to find this
23.
path for yourself.
Yeah.
And so she taught you how to aura balance and how to see energy tears and like energy losses in people.
Yeah. To that group, those kinds of things were normal every day.
Yeah.
Like they'd been just immersed in it for years. And their spiritual teacher, Neva Dale Hunter, who had died in 1978, and I never met her physically. But she had taught, Robert Waterman, Ron and Mary Holnick, Ella Vivian, and a bunch of other, people I know. And so to them, and when you walk in the room with Ella Vivian, and then I'd look at her, she would her eyes would move and she'd be looking off to the side over there. And when she did that, I knew that she was looking at my aura, because you can't see the aura by looking at it straight on. You have to look at it. You're looking, with a different vision. So it works better if you don't look directly at what you're trying to see, because then it's like your spiritual vision sees it. And and I'd see her looking at my aura, and I'd be like, oh no, she's going to know exactly what I was doing last night. And Robert was somewhat like that also. Yeah. So I started this training program with these guys, which was very full-time, very totally immersed. I moved there. But I still hadn't found my spiritual teacher. And then I'd been there just a few months. I had a dream. This guy came to me in the dream. And in the dream, we were in an olive grove. I mean, here I am, 23. I don't know what an olive grove looks like. I don't really know what an olive tree looks like. But in the dream, I just knew I was in this olive grove. There was all these olive trees. And there was this guy, a group of guys, walking down this central path down this, olive grove. And I kept looking over there like, who is this guy? And every now and then he'd look over and make eye contact with me. And I'd be like, who is this guy? And I started walking along with him and the group, and they were laughing and talking and having a good time. And I was like, they're having a good time over there. I want to be over there with them. That's where I want to be. And that was pretty much the dream. And then I went to an Insight One training a month or two later, and this guy walked in the room, and when he walked in the room, it was one of those feelings like my nervous system just kind of lit up. And I saw him, and I was like, that's the guy that was in my dream. And I turned to somebody walking in with me who I didn't know, and I said, who's that guy right there that's walking to the back of the room? She's like, oh, that's John Roger. He's the one who's created all this program and everything. I was like, yeah, well, who is he? Oh, he's a spiritual teacher. Oh, interesting. Yeah. And by the end of that training, I'd figured out that he had a spiritual organization. Some of my teachers that I was working with, Robert, L. Vivian, were initiates in the sound current tradition that he, was working with, that he was teaching people. So anyway, I did get led to my spiritual teacher, and I didn't have to go to India, right? Cool.
So where was Insight?
Insight was at the Inn of the Mountain Gods in Ruidoso, New Mexico.
Very different from India.
And that was the beginning for that. And I started my spiritual training for that. And the school that I was in at that moment, I stayed there. I was there for a couple of years, almost 3 years actually, along with, and I did get a master's degree in counseling from that program. So I did some counseling. I worked mainly with children for a while.
And then when did you start writing?
When did I start writing? Well, I used to keep notebooks and write a bunch of stuff in them when I was like 15, 16, 17 years old. Actually, in my poetry book.
Rumi would have laughed.
in the front of this book is a poem that I wrote in 1974. The name of the poem is Back Home. Oh, break free, crack the shell, sails set for sea. Be born as a seed upon the wind. Oh, pure love, oh, dear friend. Begin to wander, begin to roam. Begin to find your way back home. Become the sun shining bright. Not just sun, but pure light. Fall, my love, with the rain. Let it wash away the pain. Flow and ebb with the tide. Love, my love, in love abide.
How old were you when you wrote that?
Let's see, I think I was 19 when I wrote that.
Really beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Definitely has a Sufi-esque feel to it.
Right, which, and as it turns out, Rumi is one of my favorite poets. Yeah, I love that Sufi tradition.
And then you have a second book, Psychedelics, Transcendence and Spirituality. This is the book that I read.
Yeah, so this is, I'll do a little preface before you start talking about this. I know that nowadays it's like what is old is new again. You and I were kind of around and when the drugs were coming up and coming, LSD, psilocybin, peyote, mescaline, all that. And then it kind of died down and now it's coming back again. And you and I have talked a bit about how these drugs may have been a stepping stone into stepping into spirituality, but in my experience, and I want you to talk about yours, it puts a cap on what you can experience spiritually.
But yeah, when I met Elle, Vivian, and Robert, and they could see my aura, and then they were doing this aura balancing work, where they, take a pendulum, put it into the auric field, the electromagnetic field, and start doing, repair work and finding blocks in consciousness, clearing the blocks in consciousness. In my first balancing with Ella Vivian, she said to me, your etheric body looks like sheets flapping in the wind. I was like, yeah, you want to say more about that? And she said, yeah, all those drugs you did, they tend to rip and tear the membranes between the subtle bodies. So yeah, and she said that mine was pretty ripped up and pretty torn.
One of my intentions in talking with you is I find more and more when people talk about spirituality and going on a spiritual journey and finding themselves, it's not unusual to always bring in the drug side as if this is the way to do it. And I wanted to, because I've been around for a while, you've been around for a while, in these amazing experiences that we've gone through, it's like to bring awareness to people that that's not necessarily coupled together for you to have a full-blown, beautiful spiritual journey and experience. You do not, in fact, I would recommend not doing. This is not a right or wrong, it's just information.
So we can find your book, both of your books, on Amazon.
Yeah.
So we will put those links, of course, to your books. And we look forward to talking to you next time. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today, Winston.
Yep. Yeah, let's meet up again and talk some more.
Awesome.
So good to see you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Have a nice day.
God bless.
Thank you.